May 8, 1945, 0600 hours, Flensburg Airfield, northern Germany. Oberst Franz Becker stood on the tarmac, watching American jeeps roll past rows of Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs, their propellers stilled, fuel tanks dry. Pilots vanished into the chaos of surrender. He spat on the concrete and muttered to his ground crew. Look at them, strutting like they built these machines themselves. They won the war with numbers, not skill. 50 of their clumsy thunderbolts for every one of our fighters. When they see what we created, the jets, the rockets, the swept wings, they'll realize they beat cavemen with clubs, not engineers. He lit a cigarette, the smoke curling past a hangar door wherein Me-262 sat shrouded in canvas, and added with bitter satisfaction. Let them parade through our wreckage. They'll spend the next decade trying to copy what we invented in our sleep. Before we dive in, make sure you're subscribed. Every week, we uncover the stories the world forgot, what Oberst Becker didn't know. As those jeeps rumbled past and American intelligence officers began cataloging tail numbers with quiet efficiency, was that his contempt would curdle into something far more corrosive than defeat, irrelevance. Because the story of what happened to the Luftwaffe after May 1945 wasn't a tale of American plunder or clumsy reverse engineering. It was an industrial dismantling so methodical, so complete, that within 18 months, the world's most fearsome air force would exist only as scrap metal, museum pieces, and cautionary data in right field test reports. And the reason Eisenhower tried to stop Patton from seeing certain airfields had nothing to do with German engineering genius. It had everything to do with preventing a political firestorm over how thoroughly, how wastefully, how fast the Allies were erasing the Luftwaffe from existence. The numbers told a story that Becker couldn't see from his tarmac. On VE Day, the Luftwaffe possessed approximately 7,000 aircraft scattered across Germany, Austria, Norway, and occupied territories. 1,500 operational fighters, 800 bombers and ground attack planes, 600 trainers still flyable, and thousands more damaged, cannibalized, or sitting in factories awaiting parts that would never arrive. The Allies had detailed plans for every single airframe. Operation Eclipse called for the immediate grounding of all Luftwaffe aircraft, the confiscation of aviation fuel stocks, the arrest of senior officers, and the cataloging of technical documents before a single propeller could be smuggled east or sold to a neutral nation. Within 72 hours of surrender, British and American teams fanned out across occupied zones with one mandate: find, evaluate, destroy, or ship. Nothing flies, nothing escapes, nothing gets forgotten. But the machines themselves, the sleek Me-262s with their Jumo turbojets, the high-altitude Ta-152s, the brutish FW-190DS, the ungainly Me-163 rocket interceptors that climbed like homesick angels and glided down like bricks. These weren't just war trophies. They were data. Every rivet, every weld, every design choice represented a parallel evolution of aviation that had run on different fuels and different philosophies than American engineering. The Luftwaffe had started the war with the world's most advanced air force, fuel-injected engines that didn't cut out in negative G, cannon armament that shredded bombers, radios that worked, gun sights that computed lead. They pioneered dive-bombing doctrine, perfected the swarm formation, and sent Stukas screaming over Poland while American pilots were still learning instruments in fabric biplanes. By 1945, they'd fielded jet fighters, swept-wing research planes, rocket interceptors, guided missiles, and infrared night fighting equipment that looked like science fiction to Allied engineers. And now it all belonged to the victors. The first American to truly understand scale of the haul was Colonel Harold Watson, chief of the Army Air Force's Foreign Exploitation Section. He arrived at Lechfeld Air Base in Bavaria on May 15, 1945, and found 72 Me-262s parked in revetments, mechanics still oiling the engines because no one had told them the war was over. Watson walked the flight line with a notepad, cataloging tail numbers, checking fuel lines, running his hand over the smooth nacelles that housed the turbojets. He'd flown P-51s over Berlin and understood what these machines represented: speed that outran everything, firepower that shredded bombers in seconds, altitude performance that made interception almost impossible. One of his team members, a former Republic aviation engineer named Jack Stevens, knelt beside an engine intake and said quietly, "We're 3 years behind on this. Maybe 5. They were flying production jets while we were still testing the P-80 prototype." Watson made a note in his log. Priority 1, intact engines, technical manuals, interview design staff if alive. The doctrine for evaluating captured Luftwaffe aircraft came from hard lessons learned in North Africa and Sicily, where early war prizes had been mishandled, stripped for parts by souvenir hunters, or destroyed before proper analysis. By 1945, the AAF had a system: identify flyable aircraft, assign test priorities, crate and ship the best examples to Wright Field in Ohio, destroy the rest. Flyable meant intact engines, control surfaces, and fuel systems. Test priorities meant jets first, then high-performance piston fighters, then anything with unusual equipment, radar, rockets, guided weapons. The mechanics doing the evaluations were often former Luftwaffe ground crew working under Allied supervision, German engineers who'd rather catalog their life's work than starve in a displaced person's camp. One such mechanic, Ernst Muller, spent June 1945 at Salzburg Airport preparing an Me-262A, 1A for flight to Cherbourg. He'd serviced the aircraft since January, knew its quirks. The starboard engine ran hot. The nose gear shimmy-damped poorly. The guns jammed if you fired below 15,000 feet in cold air. And he wrote it all down in careful English for the Americans. When they asked why he was cooperating, he shrugged and said, "The war is over. The machines should teach someone something." But not everyone was so cooperative. At Rechlin, the Luftwaffe's primary test center, retreating German staff had sabotaged wind tunnels, burned design archives, and drained lubricant from engines before the Soviets arrived. At Peenemund, British intelligence found V-2 components, but also evidence that key scientists and blueprints had fled south ahead of the Red Army. The Americans quickly realized they were in a race not just to collect aircraft, but to secure the brains that built them. Operation Paperclip, initially conceived to recruit rocket scientists, expanded to include aerodynamicists, jet engine designers, avionics engineers, anyone who could explain why a Tu-152 could fight at 45,000 feet, or how the Me-262's compressor blades handled thermal stress. Over 1,600 German specialists would eventually be brought to the United States, some willingly, others because the alternative was Soviet conscription or unemployment in a shattered nation. The aircraft that made it to Wright Field became legends in their own right. The Me-262 arrived in pieces aboard a C-54 transport in July 1945, reassembled by German POWs under American supervision and flown by test pilots who treated it like a live grenade with wings. The Jumo 004 turbojets were fragile, good for maybe 25 hours before turbine blades cracked, and the fuel, J2, a synthetic kerosene, was corrosive and temperamental. But when Lieutenant Colonel Ken Chilstrom climbed into the cockpit at Muradry Lake in September 1945 and spooled up the engines, he felt the future kick him in the spine. The acceleration was brutal, the noise a banshee shriek, and at 450 miles per hour indicated the control forces went light, and the world outside turned into a gray smear. He wrote in his report, "Handling is excellent above 300 miles per hour. Below that speed, extremely poor. Gun platform stable. Visibility mediocre. Engine response sluggish. Conclusion: revolutionary design hampered by material shortages and insufficient development time. In Allied hands, with proper alloys and quality control, this aircraft would dominate any theater." That conclusion rippled through the AF, like voltage through copper, because Chilstrom wasn't saying the Germans were geniuses. He was saying they'd been desperate. The Me-262's engines used mild steel turbine blades instead of nickel alloys because Germany's strategic supply of cobalt and nickel had been bombed into rubble. The airframe used wood in secondary structures because aluminum was reserved for fighters. The guns, for 30 million Malawian Kwacha's 108 cannon, were devastating but slow-firing, 650 rounds per minute combined, because German factories couldn't machine the tighter tolerances needed for faster cycling. Every brilliant design choice had been a workaround for a collapsing industrial base. And that revelation changed the American narrative. The Luftwaffe hadn't lost because its aircraft were inferior. It lost because it couldn't build enough of them, couldn't fuel them, couldn't train pilots fast enough, and couldn't protect its factories from B-17s that flew in thousand-plane streams and turned cities into parking lots. But if the jets were prized, the operational fighters, the Bf-109s and FW-190s that had bled Allied bomber formations from 1942 to 1945, were studied with colder eyes. At Freeman Field, Indiana, the AAF established a foreign aircraft evaluation center where captured Luftwaffe fighters flew mock combat against American types. A freshly refurbished FW-190A-8, tail number 2+, was flown by Major Fred Borsotti against a P-51D in August 1945. Borsotti, a former 8th Air Force ace with 11 kills, knew the 190's reputation: brutal roll rate, heavy firepower, good climb, but stiff at high speed. The mock dogfight lasted 12 minutes. The P-51 could outturn the 190 above 15,000 feet, outdive it past 400 miles per hour, and outrange it by a factor of 3 thanks to drop tanks. But below 10,000 feet, in a turning fight, the 190 was lethal. Borsotti's debrief was blunt. Pilot skill being equal, the 190 kills the Mustang below 12,000 feet. Above that, Mustang dominates. In practice, by 1944, we owned the altitude and chose the engagement. The 190 never had a chance. The phrase, "never had a chance," haunted the German pilots who survived to see their aircraft studied by their enemies. At a POW interrogation center in Wiesbaden, Luftwaffe Major Heinz Nock, a 52 victory ace, was shown photographs of his former Bf-109G-14 being test flown at Wright Field. The interrogator, a courteous captain named Hartmann, asked what Nock thought of the American evaluation. Nock stared at the photo, his aircraft, his paint scheme, American star on the fuselage, and said quietly, "You want to know if it was a good fighter? Yes, the best we had until the jets. But you want to know why we lost? Look at the photograph. That's one aircraft. You had 10,000. We had pilots with 300 hours training. You had pilots with 400 hours and fuel for another 200. We had factories bombed every week. You had factories in Ohio no one could touch. The aircraft doesn't matter. The system matters." Nock's bitterness was echoed in diaries and memoirs collected by Allied intelligence teams, combing through wreckage and archives. General Lieutenant Adolf Galland, former general of fighters, wrote in his post-war interrogation that the Me-262 program had been sabotaged not by Allied bombs, but by Göring's interference, Hitler's demands for a bomber variant, and material shortages that turned a 1943 miracle into a 1945 desperation move. He noted dryly that Germany had built 1,400 Me-262s total, while the United States produced 15,000 P-51 Mustangs, and the Mustang, with drop tanks, could escort bombers to Berlin and back, something no German fighter could match. Galland's conclusion, underlined in red by his interrogators, read, "We built the future. You built enough of the present to bury us in it." The American industrial machine, which Becker had dismissed as brute force quantity over quality, was now dismantling the Luftwaffe with the same ruthless efficiency it had dismantled the Wehrmacht. At Erding Air Depot outside Munich, crews were processing 60 aircraft per day, photographing, measuring, cataloging, and then, if not selected for shipment, cutting them apart with acetylene torches. The sound of metal being sliced echoed across the Bavarian countryside. Me-109s reduced to engine blocks and fuselage sections. Ju-87 Stukas torched in place because no one wanted to preserve a terror weapon. FW-190 stripped of instruments and radios and then bulldozed into pits. Sergeant Mike Kowalski, a Detroit native and former Ford assembly worker, supervised a team that scrapped 42 fighters in 1 week. He told a reporter from Stars and Stripes, "Back home, we built a bomber every hour. Here, we're racing their Air Force every day. Same principle, mass production. We just apply it both ways." That casual brutality, the efficiency of destruction, was exactly what Eisenhower wanted to avoid publicizing, because by mid-1945, the American public was weary of war, hungry for demobilization, and the last thing the Supreme Commander needed was headlines about treasure troves of advanced German aircraft being systematically destroyed or shipped to America while Europe starved. When Patton, commanding Third Army, requested permission to tour Luftwaffe storage depots in his sector in June 1945, Eisenhower's staff intervened. The official reason: security concerns and ongoing intelligence operations. The real reason, documented in a memo from WW2. Patton had a habit of speaking bluntly to reporters, and the sight of hundreds of advanced German aircraft, some better than anything the Soviets had, being processed like scrap iron might raise uncomfortable questions about post-war policy, reparations, and whether the Allies were destroying evidence of their own technological shortcomings. "This is what you're telling me we couldn't build." The colonel wisely said nothing. Patton continued, "We spent 4 years learning to punch harder. They spent 4 years learning to punch faster. If this war had lasted another year, we'd be flying these, and they'd still be losing, because we can build 1,000 and they can't build 10. He didn't speak to the press about the visit, but his diary entry that night read, "Saw the German jet fighters today. Magnificent machines, wasted on a losing cause. Ike's right to keep this quiet. The American people don't need to know how close it was, or how much we're learning from the rubble." The learning curve was steep and immediate. By autumn 1945, Wright Field had become a graveyard of German ambition, a hangar complex stuffed with aircraft that represented evolutionary dead ends, brilliant innovations, and fever dream desperation in equal measure. The prize specimens, the jets, the rocket planes, the high-altitude interceptors, sat in climate-controlled spaces while teams of engineers measured, photographed, x-rayed, and occasionally cut apart to understand load paths and stress points. But the real education came from flying them. The AAF assembled a cadre of test pilots who'd survived the European Air War and understood viscerally what these machines had been designed to kill. They strapped into German cockpits, fired up German engines, and pushed these aircraft to limits their original pilots had rarely survived long enough to explore. The Me-163 Comet was the nightmare everyone wanted to understand. A rocket-powered interceptor that climbed to 30,000 feet in under 3 minutes, hit 590 miles per hour, and carried two 30mm cannon with 60 rounds each, enough for maybe 3 seconds of fire. It also used a propellant mix, C-stuff and T-stuff, that was so volatile it dissolved human flesh on contact and exploded if you looked at it wrong. The Comet had killed more of its own pilots than enemy bombers, but on paper it was untouchable. Too fast to intercept, too high to track. A pure energy fighter that traded fuel endurance for raw performance. When test pilot Major Gus Lundquist climbed into the captured Comet at Muroc in October 1945, he'd already read the German accident reports. Pilots burned alive when propellant leaked, others killed when the aircraft dissolved its own tail. One poor bastard who belly landed and was liquefied when residual T-stuff ate through the fuselage. Lundquist's flight lasted 6 minutes. He lit the rocket motor, felt the Comet punch skyward like artillery shell, watched the altimeter unwind to 35,000 feet, and then the fuel ran out, and he was a 13,000-pound glider with the glide ratio of a crowbar. He dead-sticked it onto the lake bed and climbed out shaking. His report was 2 sentences. Aircraft performance revolutionary. Operational practicality zero. That phrase, operational practicality zero, became the epitaph for half the Luftwaffe's late-war innovations. The Bachem Ba 349 Natter, a manned surface-to-air rocket that launched vertically and was supposed to ram bombers before the pilot bailed out, was evaluated and discarded as a suicide weapon dressed up as tactics. The Heinkel E-162 Volksjager, a cheap jet fighter made of wood in desperation, flew beautifully until the glue joints failed and the wings came off. The Arado AR-234 jet bomber, sleek and fast and utterly useless because it carried 3,300 pounds of bombs, while a B-17 carried 8,000, and you needed 70 Arados to deliver what 17 B-17s could drop in one mission. Every innovation told the same story. Brilliant engineering shackled to an industrial base that was running on fumes and corpses by 1945. But some German designs weren't dead ends. They were blueprints. The swept-wing research conducted at Braunschweig and Göttingen, documented in thousands of pages of wind tunnel data recovered from bombed-out facilities, showed how to delay compressibility effects and push aircraft past the sound barrier. The Me-262's engine layout, the axial flow compressor design, the afterburner experiments, the variable geometry intake studies, all of it was cataloged, translated, and handed to Pratt & Whitney, General Electric, and Westinghouse engineers who were trying to build America's first operational jet engines. The results were immediate. The General Electric J-47, which would power the F-86 Sabre and the B-47 Stratojet, incorporated compressor stage improvements derived directly from JUMO 004 teardown analysis. The swept wing on the F-86, the wing that let American pilots fight MiG-15s to a draw over Korea, came from data captured at the Luftwaffe Sandstelt outside Berlin. One LFA engineer, a mild-mannered aerodynamicist named Hans Moltop, was brought to America under paperclip and ended up at Chance Vought designing the F-A Crusader. When asked years later if he felt guilty about helping the nation that bombed his homeland, he replied evenly, "I designed wings. Wings don't have politics. They have lift and drag. The Americans understood this. The Nazis did not." While the technical harvest was being sorted in Ohio, the physical destruction continued in Europe. By December 1945, the Allies had scrapped, burned, or sunk over 4,000 Luftwaffe aircraft. The British, methodical as always, catalogued everything and saved representative examples for the RAF Museum at Hendon. The French, bitter and broke, melted down hundreds of Bf-109s and FW-190s for aluminum scrap to rebuild their own aviation industry. The Soviets, who'd overrun Luftwaffe bases in eastern Germany and Poland, shipped entire factories back to the USSR, machine tools, jigs, design documents, and enslaved German engineers who would spend the next decade building Soviet jets that looked suspiciously like the ones they designed for Messerschmitt and Focke-Wulf. At the Yak Design Bureau, the Yak 15-jet fighter that entered service in 1947 was essentially a Yak 3 airframe with a BMW 003 engine copy bolted underneath, crude, effective, and a perfect metaphor for Soviet industrial espionage. The Americans, uniquely, had the luxury of choice. They could pick the best, study it, integrate the lessons, and discard the rest. In early 1946, the Air Technical Intelligence Center at Wright-Patterson AFB held what one engineer called the world's most exclusive air show, a flight demonstration program where captured Luftwaffe fighters flew against American types in controlled evaluations. A restored FW-190D9, the long-nosed Dora, variant powered by a JUMO 213 inline engine, went head-to-head with a P-51H Mustang, the ultimate piston engine fighter America produced. The Dora was faster at low altitude, climbed harder below 15,000 feet, and rolled like a drum in a hurricane. But the Mustang had 50 caliber Brownings that outranged the Dora's 20mm cannons, a bubble canopy that gave better visibility, and drop tanks that meant it could fly to Berlin and back while the Dora was tied to a 400-mile leash. The evaluation summary noted that the FW-190D9 was an outstanding short-range interceptor rendered obsolete by strategic requirements. Translation: it was a scalpel built for a surgery that never happened, because by the time the Dora entered service in numbers, the Luftwaffe didn't control the sky over its own airfields. The pilots who'd flown these machines in combat watched from prison camps and refugee centers as their aircraft were dissected, tested, and finally erased. Lieutenant Willie Heilmann, a 28 Victory ace who'd flown FW-190s from Stalingrad to the defense of Germany, was released from a British POW camp in March 1946 and returned to what was left of his hometown near Stuttgart. He found work as a mechanic at a civilian airfield, and one day in 1947, an American C-47 landed carrying aviation journalists on a tour of reconstruction efforts. They asked if he knew anything about the Luftwaffe. Heilmann, gaunt and bitter, said, "I knew everything about it. I flew the best fighter in the world and watched it lose to the fighter that could afford to lose 10 for every one of ours. You Americans didn't beat us in the air. You beat us in Detroit and Pittsburgh. Your factories won the war. Our pilots just died trying to prove otherwise. That sentiment, the recognition that industrial capacity, not tactical brilliance, determined the war's outcome, echoed through every post-war interrogation and memoir. Oberst Johannes Steinhoff, who'd commanded jet fighter units and survived the war despite horrific burns from a takeoff crash, told American interrogators in 1946, "You want to know about the Me-262? Fine. It was the fastest fighter in the sky. It had 4 cannons that could cut a B-17 in half. It could climb to 30,000 feet in 7 minutes. And we built 1,400 of them. You built 12,000 P-47 Thunderbolts. If one of our jets was damaged, we might get parts in 3 weeks. If one of your Thunderbolts was damaged, you had a replacement in 3 days. The Me-262 was a miracle. Your logistics network was divine intervention." The Americans, always polite in these sessions, thanked him for his cooperation and filed the transcript under enemy assessment, post-war morale collapse. But the logistics network Steinhoff described wasn't just moving aircraft, it was erasing them. Operation Greenhouse, a joint US-UK program launched in January 1946, aimed to document and then destroy every remaining Luftwaffe facility capable of aircraft production or repair. Teams fanned across the Western occupation zones with sledgehammers, explosives, and bulldozers. The Messerschmitt factory at Regensburg, which had built Bf-109s at a rate of 400 per month in 1944, was dynamited in February 1946. The Focke-Wulf plant at Bremen was dismantled, its machine tools shipped to American aviation companies as reparations. The Junkers facility at Dessau, in the Soviet zone, was stripped to the concrete and reassembled near Moscow. By mid-1946, Germany's aviation industry, the most advanced in the world just 3 years earlier, existed only in museums, scrapyards, and the memories of unemployed engineers. The final act of this industrial funeral came in the summer of 1946, when the Allies decided what to do with the aircraft they couldn't use and wouldn't preserve. At Fürth Airfield near Nuremberg, American engineers oversaw the destruction of 523 Luftwaffe aircraft in a single week. They lined them up wingtip to wingtip, Me-109s, FW-190s, Ju-88s, Stukas, trainers, transports, doused them in aviation fuel, and set them ablaze. The fire burned for 3 days. Sergeant Jim Blackwell, an Army photographer assigned to document the pyre, shot 2 rolls of film and wrote in his diary, "Watched $1 billion of aircraft turn to smoke today. Some of the German workers were crying. Can't say I blame them. We're burning history. But orders are orders, and Ike wants this stuff gone before the Russians start asking questions about why we kept so much." The photographs Blackwell took, skeletal airframes glowing orange, tails and wings collapsing into ash, smoke columns visible for 20 miles, were classified restricted and wouldn't be declassified until 1973, long after anyone cared. But not everything burned. Scattered across America, in storage depots and museums and eccentric collectors' hangars, the survivors endured. The Smithsonian acquired a Me-262 and a Bf-109G and an FW-190D, preserving them as examples of enemy ingenuity and cautionary tales about what happens when science serves tyranny. Wright-Patterson kept flyable examples of nearly every Luftwaffe type for continued testing. By 1950, they'd wrung every secret from the airframes, and the jets were quietly scrapped, their engines donated to universities for turbine research. A handful ended up in private hands, pilots and collectors who saw historical value in machines that had once ruled the sky over Europe. Today, only a few dozen original Luftwaffe aircraft remain in flyable condition worldwide, and most of those are restored recreaks rebuilt with modern components and more American parts than German. The technology, though, that lived on. By 1950, every American jet fighter incorporated lessons learned from dismantling the Luftwaffe's technical corps. The swept wings, the area-ruled fuselages, the afterburners, the transonic control solutions, all of it traced back to data captured in 1945. The F, 86 Sabre that dominated Korean skies in 1951 owed its swept wing to German research and its engine to American industrial might. A hybrid that proved Heilmann's bitter point. You could have the best ideas in the world, but if you couldn't build 1,000 of them, you lost. The Soviet MiG-15, the Sabre's adversary, was even more directly descended from captured German technology. Its engine was a reverse-engineered Junkers design, its wing copied from German wind tunnel reports, its cannon a scaled-up Mauser. The Korean War, in a dark irony, was fought with aircraft whose bloodlines ran through Berlin, 1945. By 1955, the last operational Luftwaffe aircraft, a handful of trainers and transports kept flying by civilian operators, were finally retired. The Swiss Air Force, which had interned several Bf-109s that landed in neutral territory during the war, kept them flying until 1949, and then quietly sold them for scrap. The Spanish, who'd built Bf-109s under license with Hispano engines, flew them until 1965, the last piston fighters in European service. And in America, the Foreign Technology Division continued to study German aviation documents, radar designs, jet engine metallurgy, supersonic research. Well into the 1960s, mining a defeated enemy's intellectual legacy for any scrap that might give the United States an edge in the Cold War arms race. The final irony came in 1969, when the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum opened and displayed the Me-262 next to an American P-80 shooting star. The placard read, "The Messerschmitt Me-262 was the world's first operational jet fighter. Despite its advanced design, it could not alter the outcome of World War II." Beside that exhibit, a yellowed copy of a Luftwaffe pilot's diary sat in a display case, open to an entry from April 1945. The entry, written by an unknown lieutenant from JG-7, read, "We flew faster than anything in the sky. We carried cannons that could destroy any bomber. We had the technology of tomorrow. And yet every day there were fewer of us and more of them, until one morning I looked up and the sky belonged to America. Speed is nothing without fuel. Innovation is nothing without factories. We learned this too late." If you love untold stories from history's darkest hours, subscribe and join us on the next mission through time.